Sealed in this box is a laptop born for developers and conceived by two companies that, in my mind, are polar opposites. On the one hand, we have HP, a company that over the past several years has become synonymous with proprietary hardware, lockdown firmware, and funding anti-right to repair lobbyists. On the other hand, we have System76, a small company based right here in Colorado, which handcrafts stunning hardware that's highly repairable with open source firmware powered by their own Linux distro, the increasingly popular PopOS. What happens when these two seemingly contradictory companies come together? Can we get a perfect fusion of advanced hardware that HP is capable of providing with free, open source, and developer optimized software from System76? Well, after this logo sting, a couple weeks will have passed and we should know the answer to that question. Let's check out the HP Dev 1. Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, and 2 weeks have passed. I've spent a lot of time with the laptop. I've typed thousands of lines of code, I've run dozens of tests, and I'm ready to share my findings and thoughts on the HP Dev 1. But let's start back at the beginning. HP adopts very familiar eco-friendly packaging. Opening the fiberboard box, we find the Dev 1 wrapped in parchment paper. Under the laptop is the included paperwork and the 65-watt charging brick and cable. With the Dev 1 unboxed, we can check out the design, build quality, and specs. First, the entire chassis is constructed from aluminum alloy and finished in a space gray. The laptop measures 213 millimeters deep by 323 millimeters wide by 21.5 millimeters thick and weighs in at 3.2 pounds, placing it in the ultra portable category. It's powered by the AMD Ryzen 7 Pro 5850U 8-core 16-thread CPU and comes with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3200 memory, a 1TB NVMe Gen 3 SSD, 802.11 AC Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 5, and a 53 watt-hour battery. The Dev 1 has a very familiar wedge-shaped design. However, there is only a single millimeter of height difference between the rear and front of the deck. There is about 2 millimeters of cover flex with light to moderate pressure, and there's virtually no keyboard deck flex with moderate pressure. Overall, the laptop is very solidly built and has unique styling with the stylized bevels on most edges. For the feature set overview, we'll start at the top and work down, beginning with the integrated 720p webcam with built-in lens cover and dual multi-array microphones. This is the raw video and audio from the HP Dev 1 camera and microphone. On screen, it doesn't look too bad for a 720p webcam. Here's a color check. I did listen to a small snippet of audio from an earlier test recording, and it did seem a bit clipped, but I did notice that the levels seem to auto-adjust. I currently have the mic gain set to about 50%. Additionally, you'll notice the built-in shutter is just a shutter, so therefore doesn't physically disconnect the camera or the microphone. The screen is a 14-inch 1920 by 1080 IPS 60Hz display with a peak brightness of 1000 nits. Now, this display is glass, and the first thing I noticed when I unboxed this laptop was the prismatic effect on the screen when it caught the light. There is also very limited viewing angles, which to me means HP is using a heavy anti-glare layer in the glass, but there's no anti-reflection treatment. This results in any point light source in the room causing the rainbow effect, and the shiny glass screen reflects everything. HP combats this by pumping the max brightness up to 1000 nits, which is going to have a negative effect on battery life. This treatment also renders my screen luminance meter useless. However, plugging in my Innocen portable display, mirroring the display, setting it to its max 400 nits with the HP brightness maxed, the two are pretty close in overall brightness. Now, HP does state that the glass can reduce perceived brightness by up to 20%, but it seems a lot more than that to me. However, the Dev 1 does seem to have much higher peak brightness. With the combination of the treatment and reflection, I found that I did have to keep the display brightness cranked up to 3/4 or higher in even moderately lit environments. However, in a dimly lit room with the good peak brightness, text in the terminal and in the various development shells I used was very sharp with great contrast. There is an 85 key backlit keyboard with a half height function row, as well as an auxiliary key column on the far right of the keyboard. The keys are well balanced with both a firm top bump and bottom out with actuation somewhere in the middle. I did type quite a lot on these and I found the keys a little bit too tightly spaced due to the final auxiliary column. However, this is a very common keyboard layout for a 14-inch laptop, so if you're used to it, it shouldn't be a problem. What isn't common outside of a Lenovo ThinkPad is the track point, which in combination with the two physical buttons on top of the trackpad works pretty good. You can set sensitivity and acceleration controls and settings to meet your needs, so I assume people who really like track points, or whatever HP calls it, will like this. There's also a trackpad measuring 110 millimeters by 60 millimeters. It's glass and has a smooth glide. Multi-gestures work well, but it is a diving board or top hinge type trackpad, so the physical click doesn't actuate until about 15 millimeters below the hinge. There are top mounted speakers on either side of the keyboard, which are loud but have a flat soundstage and seem to be tuned for vocals with very little bass reproduction. For the demo, I'll start with the true audio, then the raw speaker audio for comparison.
Cause you a bad money, she don't love money, she break grass real fast like gunman. When I swim down to the deep end, wanna know all my secrets honestly. Cause you a bad money, she don't love money, she break grass real fast like gunman. When I swim down to the deep end, wanna know all my secrets honestly.
For expandability, on the left side of the laptop, there are two 5 gigabit type A ports and a headset jack. On the left, we have the power barrel jack and an HDMI 2.0 port and two 10 gigabit type C ports with power delivery and DisplayPort alt mode. So while the Dev 1 comes with a barrel charger, you can charge and power the laptop via the USB-C ports. However, a glaring omission for developer targeted laptop is no Ethernet port. As far as repairability and upgradability, the bottom panel can be removed by loosening the 5 captive torque screws and unclipping the panel. After breaking a spudger, I discovered the best way to attack this was at the edge along the vent. However, I'm docking points because the possibility of snapping one or more of these plastic clips is high. However, once inside, we can simply pull off these EMI shields to access two SODIMM memory modules, which can be upgraded to 64 gigabytes, and an M.2 NVMe SSD, which I believe is upgradable to up to a 4 gig drive. And the Wi-Fi module is removable. As far as repairability, the components don't look extremely locked in or glued down at all, and while the USB-C ports are attached to the main board, the power connector and the USB-A ports are separate. So as long as third-party repair shops are able to acquire parts, overall the machine is very repairable. Finally, as I mentioned in the opener, the HP Dev 1 is running on PopOS, making I think the only mainstream laptop brand that comes with a GNU Linux operating system out of the box. And out of the box, the PopOS setup looks exactly like the initial setup of PopOS on any other system, with the exception of a licensing agreement and the ability to opt in or out of analytic collection about the hardware and software environment. Other than that, I don't see any areas where the distro is customized in any way for this hardware, except for the integration of LVFS firmware updates, which I discovered by accident after installing GNOME software, which is awesome. Not having to install a Windows partition to install firmware updates is great. I'll get into PopOS and how well it is or isn't integrated into the hardware in a bit, but first let's take a look at the performance of this laptop. The Dev 1, as the name implies, is very specifically developed for developers, coders, programmers, system admins, anyone who spends most of their time in a terminal, shell, or development environment. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Now, on top of writing, debugging, and running code, almost all exclusively Python, that's all I'm capable of doing nowadays without embarrassing myself, I did a lot of testing, running, and compiling code, but to keep the testing reproducible, I'm using the Phoronix test suite to test developer-specific scenarios. There are 20 graphs, and to get through this quickly, I'm just going to click through them quickly without much commentary. If you need time to study a test of particular interest to you, the pause button is your friend here. Basically, for those who need to know this info, you know what to look for. For anyone else that's just curious and isn't really sure what these tests are, I put a link in the description that will list all the individual tests and exactly what they're testing. For reference, I'm comparing the Dev 1 to 4 different systems: an 11th and 12th gen Intel Framework laptop and an i5-12400 based desktop, all running PopOS, and a 2020 M1 Mac Mini for a few compatible tests. I also tested the laptops plugged in and on the balanced power profile, as these tests demonstrate that was the profile with the best performance. In a short multi-threaded task, the Linux kernel compiled 2 seconds faster on balance compared to performance, and about 44 seconds faster than the battery saver profile. On a longer compile, the performance profile took over 15% longer than balanced, while now we see that the battery saver was only about 7% slower than the performance mode. This behavior is typical of thin, low-powered laptops in multi-threaded performance, but what was surprising was when I ran fast single-core tests, the balance profile was still 16% faster. This comes down to power efficiency and management and thermal headroom, or the lack of it, but we'll get more into that in a bit. Let's look at some performance tests, and unless otherwise noted, these results are in seconds, so lower is better. And if there's a 0 for the Mac Mini, it just means that test wasn't available in the Mac test suite. Okay, let's wrap this up with an overall average of all tests, and we see the 11th gen Intel laptop is about 65% behind the Dev 1, while the Dev 1 falls just 15% short of the 12th gen. Recalculating the scores for just the test that the Mac Mini was able to run, we actually see it beat them all, including the Intel desktop, but of course the Mac is much less compatible for cross-platform development. Another reason I went through those quickly, for many developers, the performance of their local machine isn't really that important, as a lot of this work has moved to cloud-based development environments. So as long as you have a good internet connection so you can SSH into a remote instance or enough memory to open a Chrome tab or two, you're good to go. For example, I have a couple of development environment containers running on my server, and I can just, for an example, open up a Jupyter Labs console, or I can remote into my Windows VM and maybe debug and compile a Visual Studio project that requires more power than a laptop's able to deliver. Or maybe just access my work computer from home and pick up right where I left off. The ability to upgrade the memory is key here. 64 gigs, that'll get you at least 4 Chrome tabs, right? But a huge omission in my view is the lack of an Ethernet port. Yes, dongles exist, but HP puts folding Ethernet ports on their EliteBook, so why not this? Maybe I'm being over analytical here though. What do y'all think? Should a laptop targeting developers have Ethernet? Let me know in the comments. Moving on, one big thing that's very important in a laptop is battery life and power efficiency, and unfortunately, this didn't perform as well as I expected. Now, this does come with some caveats. Using the Underwriter Laboratories battery life test requires looping a specific video with the native media player in full screen mode with the display set at 200 nits. But first, the native Linux media player requires third-party codecs that use software rendering only, so I used the VLC player, which allows for hardware decoding on Linux. That should help, but you remember, due to that weird glass, I can't use my meter to set the exact brightness. So again, I set the external display to 200 nits and then just eyeballed it. And of course, the glass can be affecting that too. In any case, the laptop shut down after only 6 hours and 22 minutes, coming in behind the 11th gen Intel CPU. For real-world use, I wrote a small Python game, switching between the Python IDE and Visual Code Studio. After knocking some of the rust off my coding skills, I was able to finish, debug, and play my little YouTube simulator. That's an Elevated Systems video uploaded onto YouTube, and then comes the random algorithm that I have to navigate or it just kills the video, and I start over with the next idea. It's an impossible game. Now, I shared all of that to tell you that creating and running that game, plus I shot the B-roll shots of the remote access stuff in that time frame, but it all took 4 hours and 4 minutes. In unplugged and unbalanced power mode, the battery went from 100% to 41%, so 59% battery drain in 4 hours of light use. We can calculate that out to about 6 hours 45 minutes of light use on a single charge. Now, this again in part comes down to the display. Here, although it looks bright because I have the ISO cranked on the camera, this is a dimly lit room. I only have one overhead light on, and to cut through the reflection and that polarized rainbow effect, I have the screen set to 3/4 brightness. That's up to 750 nits, which is a huge drain on the battery. Additionally, the battery drain was about 10% in 24 hours in suspend mode. Again, not great. So the battery life isn't as good as it could be, mostly because there's no efficiency improvements made in the software, and the problem is magnified due to the unnecessary screen brightness that's due to the weird glass treatment. But that brings up my next point, and the one real disappointment I've had in this laptop in the 2 weeks I've been using it. It's the lack of any obvious hardware and software integration. You get what is essentially a standard HP laptop: proprietary lockdown and limited UEFI, lockdown firmware, no core boot, no open source EC firmware, no ability to disable the AMD PSP, and a mostly vanilla PopOS install. With the exception of the analytics collection and LVFS firmware updates, there's no other work done to optimize the operating system on this hardware. There are no custom power profiles pre-built, just the basic Debian-based vanilla ones that don't work very well. Simple things that are common problems with Linux aren't addressed. Automatic screen brightness unusable, standby power consumption bad, the Wi-Fi bandwidth is restricted to Wi-Fi 5. These are issues that can be fixed. I've done entire videos on tweaking Linux on the framework laptop, but there shouldn't be a need to spend time messing around trying to figure out all the best TLP power settings when HP could have baked that into their OEM PopOS image and implemented them in a way where updates or new kernels won't break them. Now, I didn't dig into all the code to see if there were any changes, but I did swap out the SSD and installed the stock version of PopOS. All the required updates were delivered with an update, and all the test results and power use was identical. And in case anyone was wondering, Windows installs and runs great on the Dev 1. All the driver updates needed were even delivered through Windows updates. I didn't do a bunch of performance testing on Windows, but I did run the UL battery life test, and well, 12.5 hours. That's more of what I expected. The Ryzen Pro 5850U is a very efficient CPU as long as the operating system manages it correctly. Realistically, I think I might be being overly critical of this laptop because I really wanted to love it, because having mainstream hardware that comes with GNU Linux natively is pretty much non-existent, which as an independent reviewer is not how you should go into a product review, with preconceived notions or an emotional mindset. So objectively, the HP Dev 1 is a very well-built laptop. It's fairly upgradable and repairable. The features were very purposely selected for a Linux machine. Using a last-gen processor, Wi-Fi 5, no biometric login device like a fingerprint reader eliminates a lot of the common problems you can run into running Linux on the latest hardware. The screen is a problem unless you work in a dark environment. The performance is very good, and for anyone coming from the practice of installing Linux on older hardware to extend its usability will be blown away with the performance and even the battery life. But anyone who buys new hardware and immediately replaces Windows with their preferred Linux flavor and then optimizes it for that hardware, probably won't be very impressed by this. I understand the target demographic for this laptop has the knowledge and experience to optimize the platform, but that doesn't mean they should have to or even want to. Personally, I was looking forward to taking this out of the box, installing the development packages and dependencies I use, and brushing up on my coding skills. I didn't want to have to fix Linux first on a system that came with Linux. But just like Linux users comes in many flavors, so what doesn't work for me might be the perfect fit for someone else. Let me know what you think of the HP Dev 1. Does it seem like a Linux machine you'd be interested in, or would you prefer something like an actual System76 laptops with all the open source goodies they provide? Or are you someone who just finds the hardware you like and then installs and configures the software environment to fit your needs? Let us know in the comments. While you're there, be sure to check, as I'll be installing TLP and doing some power efficiency tuning. I'll update in the comments with what kind of performance per watt I can coax out of this thing. Finally, don't forget to click that like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.